Hello and a very warm welcome to the brand new edition of Policy Watch. I'm Kriti Mishra. Today we'll take a closer look at the draft e-commerce policy. The draft policy has been divided into 6 categories: data infrastructure development, e-commerce marketplaces, regulatory issues, stimulating the domestic digital economy, and export promotion through e-commerce. The policy seeks to identify the paths to achieve the objectives through a multi-pronged approach. The aim of the policy is to enable stakeholders to fully benefit from the progressive digitization of the economy. And for more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador to WTO, Dr. S.P. Sharma, Chief Economist, PhD Chamber, and Dr. H.P. Kumar, former CMD, NSIC. Welcome to Raj Sabha Television, all of you. Mr. Dasgupta, let me come to you first. A well-defined policy is required for providing level playing field and also for facilitating global trade negotiations, for instance, at the WTO. Take us through the importance and the crucial highlights of the draft e-commerce policy.
The first thing which we need to bear in mind is that e-commerce has been evolving very fast over the past decade or so. And most jurisdictions are still not very familiar or conversant with the developments that have taken place globally and the direction in which things are moving and the pace of the developments. So it is important to have a set of policy guidelines which will enable our domestic stakeholders, our industry, the MSMEs, the larger players, all to benefit from a policy framework. And one of the things which also needs to be borne in mind is that the customer, the consumer, also has to be enabled to reap benefits from this framework. So the draft e-commerce policy has tried to address all these issues through its 6 facets, and it has put together a package which has been developed through intensive consultations with stakeholders across the industry, from consumer protection organizations, from different ministries of the government, and it has also taken a cue from the developments that have taken place elsewhere in the world. In the advanced economies, for instance, things have stabilized to a certain extent, but there also things are evolving. So it is a mixture of experiences which have been gathered from different countries, different kind of frameworks, and our own concerns. And the bottom line is that we need to provide a level playing field for domestic industry, for domestic consumers, and that there should not be any exploitation. There should be transparency in all the dealings of the e-marketplace.
Absolutely. So there should be no exploitation and there has to be transparency. But also, Mr. Dasgupta, the Indian e-marketplace or e-commerce space was pegged at around $38.5 billion in 2017, which is expected to touch $200 billion by the year 2026. Despite this high growth rate, it is still at a very nascent stage, accounting for around 3% of the retail sector. How will this policy structure the entire e-commerce space?
One of the things which I wanted to point out in this context is that if you look at the global population above 14, which is 5.5 billion, 50% of this population has access to smartphones. And it is going to go up very rapidly over the next decade or so. So e-commerce, it may start from rather humble beginnings, but it is going to, that is a projection made by many economists, it is going to be pose a very serious challenge to the brick and mortar stores, to the retailers who do actual physical deliveries across the counter. So e-commerce is something which perhaps will be the future in many ways in developing countries. Of course, it has already started posing a threat to brick and mortar stores in the developed world. So that is why it is important for the government to come out with a policy and to try to fill up the regulatory space, have a regulator. For instance, the e-commerce policy talks of a data regulating authority. before we get into agreements at the WTO or other fora on various aspects of regulation, if we have our own regulation in place, it always helps us to negotiate rather than doing it in a policy vacuum and being guided by the developed countries or those who have already put in place a regulatory framework. That then makes us feel handicapped.
Absolutely. So it is important to have a regulatory framework and also to implement it in a very effective manner. Coming to you, Dr. Kumar now. Data is the new oil. That is what this policy accentuates. How will this policy ensure that the data generated in India is used for the progress of its citizens?
See, that is the main objective of this policy. One of the main objectives, of course, that presently all these foreign companies which are operating in India, we have no control over the information or the data being generated by them through various e-commerce platforms, whether it is purchase and sale of products or payment systems or others. So one major objective, of course, which is very important, of course, the policy clearly lays down that data generated in India will remain in India, first of all. Data generated outside, which is used in India, may be communicated and shared with other. So it's a clear clarity which was not there earlier. But besides the data of course becomes a very valuable thing, as you rightly say. Data becomes the new oil because it has a value. Because all these future developments which are going to take place with the digital India, virtually expanding, data will become a very valuable resource, particularly with artificial intelligence based, enterprises coming up, whether it is in large industries or micro, small enterprises. Everybody would like to, structure their products around the data. So naturally, data is a very valuable resource. But besides the data sharing issue, see, data protection also becomes very important.
Absolutely.
And the clarity about the rules and laws about data protection and coupled with data protection is the privacy laws, which are needing some refurbishment.
Absolutely.
So I would say that as a policy, we are, I think, on track because there was no clarity earlier. Even other countries also have been, on the verge of bringing out these similar policies. Particularly India, Brazil, South Africa, that IPSA forum, I was part of that e-commerce framework. So all the countries are interested, in fact, to protect their data, and India being the largest, generator of data. So we have to be really very, proactive in doing that. But besides the data, there are other policy issues which have come up in this draft policy and which are really welcome.
Absolutely.
As Mr. Dasgupta rightly mentioned, that the competitiveness of small kirana and mom and shop traders and micro enterprises, more than 90% of the country's enterprises, business enterprises, are in the informal sector. So they need some kind of a policy framework which really can protect them from the large, companies which are coming from various countries and spending a lot of money. Their financial muscle is so large that it really overtakes all the wherewithals of these small and micro enterprises. So naturally they need some kind of a policy which can really protect them. So that is another area where I feel that the policy is good and is welcomed by the small traders, micro enterprises and those informal enterprises which are spread in all corners of the country. So I would really welcome the policy, and some more clarity may be needed, of course, because various people are giving different suggestions which are being collated, and particularly inventory based model, what is going to happen. Some suggestions have been given, but then that is not enough. We need some more improvements in that model. So I think as the time goes, we will surely come up with more suggestions so that the policy can be refined. But as of now, the policy seems to be quite acceptable.
So policy is acceptable, and I'll take your concern to Dr. Sharma. Dr. Sharma, Dr. Kumar has pointed out, on one hand, there has to be protection of the mom and pop stores. On the other hand, there's argument about providing level playing field. Where do we find the right balance?
I believe after the Lehman crisis, this is the most significant development in the global economic system, that advent of e-commerce. Now, globally, market size is more than $33 trillion. And as you mentioned that we are at around 38, 39, $40 billion.
Yes.
And the anticipation is that we will become $200 billion economy, e-commerce economy by 2026. That is true, that we are the growing market and we have the largest consumer base in the world ecosystem, the youngest population. So at this juncture, it's become very crucial to protect our policy environment, firstly, and to provide a level playing field for the domestic players, because there should not be any first mover advantage, firstly, because of certain parameters, like sometimes some business conglomerates, they have access to the data and they have few strengths. That's why they capture the market sometimes, and the second mover advantage is totally demoralized or undermined. So at this juncture, the policy of Government of India, the e-commerce draft policy, is very, very crucial to implement that and to move and to give a shape to the economy, because this is the emerging area. This area is providing a major growth momentum to the economy, because this is not only the e-commerce that will provide the growth momentum. This is the overall development of the economy. Through e-commerce, we have to generate our digital India also. Digitalization should also be boosted up with the e-commerce policy, and the digitalization is also in complementarity with the e-commerce, because side by side we have announced so many reforms, starting from Make in India, Digital India. All these reforms are very complementary between the e-commerce and the growing economic size. So at this juncture, this becomes very, very important that we should provide firstly the level playing field to our domestic players. They should not be undermined because of the certain strengths like data access and other parameters. So Government of India has very rightly provided that there are norms and regulations for each and every player in the market. Because India is a growing market, firstly, we have to develop our infrastructure in the e-commerce. And second, we have to provide the data protection, which is very, very important, as mentioned by Dr. Kumar and Dr. Das, that data are our national asset actually, because we have a largest consumer base and we have a lot of data and lot of developments in our economy. We are a dynamic economy. Earlier we were slow, then steady and fast. Now we are the fastest moving economy in the world economic system. And projections are that we will shortly, in the next few years, we are going to touch the double-digit growth rate. So at this juncture, our consumer base and our demand is increasing each and every day. And the size of the e-commerce is also increasing. $38 billion is a significant increase during the last few years. Earlier, a few years ago, we were only $20 billion. So if the size of the economy and size of the e-commerce market is increasing very significantly, then there must be some reforms and must be some regulatory environment for the domestic as well as for the foreign players. So I don't see any protectionism in this policy. This is only for the level playing field for the domestic players, that the foreign players and the domestic players should also be at an equal platform to perform in the market.
You talked about protectionism. Now, certain industry voices have called this draft excessively protectionist in nature. Now, talking about China, protectionism helped China build its tech economy in a giant manner. Many argue that why can't India also follow that path, and why can't India also adopt that strategy?
Because we are different from China. China's market and India's market are totally different from each other, though the size of the economy and the economic growth rates are similar, but the economic behavior and the economic policies are totally different. So we cannot adopt the policies adopted by China, because China has different model of growth. Earlier they were focusing on the external policy, export policy. Now they are tilting towards the protectionism and to boost up their domestic economy, because they are not finding any place in the global marketplace because of the increased protectionism by the advanced economies. So at this juncture, I believe our policy environment should not be tilted towards the thought process of the China's policy makers, because we are different and we are growing, and our growth projections are now higher than China. Now we are the fastest moving economy. We should should have our own momentum and our own thought process and own policies. So I believe the government of India has very rightly focused on this policy at this juncture, and the policy framework is very good and in line with the expectation of the industry.
Absolutely. So the policy is in line with the expectations of the industry, and also the fact that we have our own economic trajectory and also our policies. But talking about data protection now, Dr. Dasgupta, at this juncture, we do not have any legal framework that would impose restrictions on cross-border flow of data. How do we ensure data privacy and protection?
I think the data protection bill, of course, is under consideration, and the Supreme Court has also given guidelines, so to say, in how we should go about it. And it's just a matter of time before we have the data protection bill converted into an act. And there would be other acts and regulations required to fill up the regulatory vacuum in the e-commerce space. So data protection, the data of a private citizen is something on which the Honorable Supreme Court has said very clearly that the citizen must have control over that data. So there are different kinds of data. For instance, the data which is generated by banking institutions and insurance institutions for appraising the credit score. There are data which are in the public space. For instance, data at a traffic junction. And then there is data about consumer preferences, which is collected from e-marketplaces, social web networking sites, etc. Now, that data can be utilized in a very useful manner to predict consumer preferences, to tailor a particular product or a range of services to cater to a particular individual. And that information, if for instance I am a producer and I know that this is the kind of a watch which is being preferred and which will probably sell very well, so I will use my manufacturing facility or my vendors to provide that kind of a model, and I will have that advantage. Now, with these very large corporations coming into the picture, the smaller people, as Dr. Sharma mentioned, the first mover has tremendous advantages, and because of near monopoly conditions existing in other markets, some markets abroad, there has been distortions in the market. Prevention of market distortion and protection of consumers is one of the underlying themes running through the e-commerce policy, and that can only happen when we put in place a framework where data generated from e-commerce platforms, let's say social networking sites, this is available, this is owned by the government, and anybody can access that data. So it is neutral to who has collected that data. It could be a very large corporation which collects that data and keeps it to itself and then sells it. Now, it has been generated from the marketplace. The citizens are the owners of that, and the government is the trustee and retains that hold over that data. That is the underlying philosophy of this e-commerce policy about data protection.
I'll take that to Dr. Kumar now. Sir mentioned about distortion. How does the government create a regulatory environment where there's genuine competition in the market, specifically in the e-commerce space?
Well, that is a very important issue. In fact, bringing in regulation and an ecosystem which really encourages the competition and removes the anti-competitive practices should be the hallmark of any policy. And we in India would look at what? In fact, the policy should address what? Policy should address the consumer's interests on the one side. It should address the market's interest, the industry's interests, the traders' interests on the other, and also protect the data as well as our country's interests vis-a-vis the foreign players who are working in India. So, if the policy takes care of all these three issues, I think the policy should be good enough, in fact, to be implemented. Now, if we compare the policy, if we really evaluate the policy, draft of the policy which is in domain, I find substantially it addresses the issues, substantially. There is a talk of setting up a consumer protection authority.
That's right.
I think that should be a very welcome step, because as of now the consumers under the e-market system are not at all protected at all. I would say absolutely it is only one-sided. Second thing, the competitiveness of amongst various players, whether it is foreign players or Indian players, the healthy competitiveness really has to take shape, because still it is not there. Although these foreign companies who are indulging in anti-competitive practices are bleeding, they are losing money, but still in order to capture the market, in order to defeat the smaller players, they are indulging in those, I would say, I mean, as I see it, anti-competitive practices. So naturally, the provision in the policy, draft policy, to bring in regulation, to bring healthy competition in the whole sector is a welcome measure, and we should really welcome it.
I'll get industry perspective on that. Dr. Sharma, the draft says that consumer protection is of utmost importance. How do we ensure that there's effective grievance redressal mechanism for the consumers?
Yes, that is very, very important, because this is one of the objectives of the new e-commerce policy, draft e-commerce policy. Because now consumers are the backbone of the Indian economy, because of the consumer development we cannot grow in the higher and higher trajectory. That is the base of our economy. And similarly, data are the national asset, and these data are for the development of the Indian economy. So at this juncture, this becomes very crucial, that how to protect the consumerism and consumer protection becomes important. Now the regulation provided is that there are a lot of developments from this. Sometimes they provide the discounts, and sometimes they provide the heavy discounts, and there are some bulk buyers also in the market, that they capture the whole market, and they provide the benefits to the consumers one by one and in a very strategic manner. So at this juncture, sometimes consumers are not aware about the developments in the marketplace, and there must be some regulatory to check all the developments. So this policy provides all the checks and balances to protect the consumer, and to how to complain about the if something is happening wrong in the market, then they have every right to inform the regulatory environment that this is happened, and this should be addressed for the benefit of the consumer. So I believe this policy is very rightly focusing on all the parameters, starting from the development of the economy, data protection, and the consumer protection, and for the overall development of the economy, and to create employment opportunities. Because level playing field, we are talking about the level playing field, because of level playing field, our economy or our industry is impacted. Earlier, we were signing so many free trade agreements, but our ease of doing business was not in our favor. All we were at around 156 or 160 in the ease of doing business, and all the free trade partners were in the ambit of 50. They were very good in the ease of doing business, and they were trading with us, and the advantage was in favor of the other trading partners. Now with the increase in the ease of doing business, now we are at 77. We have improved a lot during the last 4-5 years. Now the level playing field is becoming important and becoming visible at the at our domestic level.
So there are checks and balances.
Similarly,
yes.
Now the services sector, like the e-commerce, we are opening up market for the e-commerce and other liberalized financial era. But at this juncture, we should also improve our domestic environment in the regulatory terms. So that is the need of the hour, and government has very rightly focused on this, and they have implemented and drafted this policy.
So there are all checks and balances
Yes.
for protecting the consumer.
Yeah.
I have last 1 minute. Dr. Dasgupta, what are the anti-counterfeiting measures in this policy, and how will this policy promote exports from India?
As far as I'll take up the second question first, the MSMEs and the smaller manufacturers and exporters, they find it a difficult problem to wend their way through the regulatory maze. Different forms have to be filled in, money has to be deposited. So There are things which the government has talked about, and that is about providing an interface, electronic interface. So you can press a few buttons and deposit money, for instance, get bank realization certificates, to government agency for disbursal of duty drawback, for instance. So this is part of the export promotion measures for e-commerce. The other aspect is about anti-counterfeiting. I think this has already found a place a very prominent place in the policy, and it says that anybody who sells on an e-commerce platform will have to ensure first that e-commerce platform will be responsible for any counterfeit items getting sold on its e-commerce platform. The second thing is it must have guarantees from its sellers or vendors that they will not be selling counterfeit or pirated products on the platform. So that and there are checks and balances even in press note 2, which talks about e-retail of FDI. There the compliance has been sought through an audit, and the report will have to be submitted to the RBI every year. So there are things which are on the evolutionary path, and I think this is a very, very welcome step, because counterfeit items were finding their way into the e-commerce platforms. So this is a very welcome step, and I think the policy direction is the right one, and of course the regulatory vacuum will have to be filled in through acts, through regulations, rules, etc.
Absolutely. So it's a welcome step, and this policy will further ensure ease of doing business in India. On that note, thank you so much for joining us. So the draft policy takes forward the Digital India initiative and puts in place secure digital space. That's all we had for you in this edition. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned to Rajya Sabha Television.